with following up on the announcement that Nina Helstein made at the bridge, which is that we've actually joined a partnership with the Metro History Fair and the Chicago Metro History Education Center to begin a Clarence Darrow History Award. So when young people submit or apply, I guess submit to the Metro History Fair their projects, there will also be one for somebody submitting a project related to Clarence Darrow, which we're really excited about. And this will be an annual award. Nina mentioned that Marissa Howe received our first award, our inaugural award last year. And what we're watching is going to be a few minutes of the documentary that she put together. So Marissa, do you want to come back and say a couple more minutes about the project, and then we'll watch a few minutes of it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, the volume's not working right now. Sorry about that. I think what we can do after, towards the end, we can put it just on the laptop itself and have the sound there in the back. But essentially, one of the things is about the Chicago Metro History Fair. It's a project. It's a program that involves people that are basically of any age up until high school. There are two sections: junior division, senior division. Basically, junior division is 8th grade and younger. Junior division, senior division is high school. So I was in the senior division when I made this. It's basically to do this kind of project when you're a student. It's I did a documentary, but you don't necessarily have to do a documentary. You can do a poster board, you can do a website, you can do a dramatic presentation, you can do all manner of things. But this documentary was about Clarence, obviously about Clarence Darrow, but the main focus of it was what he did during his life in Illinois and around the entire country to do with labor and the death penalty, and his work on other matters that were basically either overlooked when he first started working on them, or his opinions were very, very, very much in the minority of the time. And the importance of Darrow, I guess, can't be understated in the sense that he was so ahead of his time in all of those things. As far as labor, he was first involved with labor in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s because of the Pullman strikes, and he was influential with the pardoning of a few of those involved with the Haymarket affair. And he was also really influential in the Pullman strike when he went from being a lawyer for the very railroad company that was involved to defending the strikers and Eugene Debs, and actually forming a friendship with Debs, which was pretty incredible transformation for him. There was also the Leopold and Loeb case. There's the Scopes trial. There's a whole manner of different things. If there was a very important court case around his time, you pretty much were sure that Darrow was involved. And so I guess I'm quite happy that this prize, this award now exists, because one of the things that I was first interested in when getting into Darrow is that I noticed that no one else at the History Fair had a project about Darrow, which was surprising considering how much he did. There were projects about the Scopes trial, there was at least one project about the Pullman strike, but there was nothing on Darrow specifically, and I hope that this would encourage more of that. So, shall I pause it?
Yes.
Or
You guys want to have it running while we're having our speakers, or we'll turn it off?
No.
I think we should turn it off.
Okay, we're at start.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the Metro History Education Center, which sponsors the Metro History Fair and now this award, works to engage students in the study of history and helps them build high-level thinking skills, engage them in civic life, and foster their intellectual and self-confidence. And I think that Marissa is a perfect example of what they're seeking to do. Each year this award is going to recognize a history project that best exemplifies Darrow's ideals. And again, I think this is a perfect inaugural project. And I think we also could be running it at the end of the morning as well for anybody who wants to be able to see it in its entirety. Thank you. So as those of you who know, I'm Anita Weinberg, one of the conveners of this program now. And as those of you who've been here before know, each year we focus on a pressing topic or issue or challenge of the day that unfortunately also existed when Darrow was alive, and on which he held very strong views and worked hard to overcome or to enforce his positions. The rights of labor unions, death penalty, freedom of speech, racial justice and equity, elimination of inequality and poverty. Unfortunately, our society and our state right now has made it very easy for us to come up with topics that we can explore every year. This year we've chosen to focus on the issue of immigration and explore the role of undocumented laborers in immigration. So I want to tell you a little bit briefly about Darrow's views on immigration, and there's not that much. However, in 1929, he participated in a debate with Dr. Lothrop Stoddard, an American historian, journalist, eugenicist, and political theorist. Over his lifetime, Stoddard authored over 24 books, most related to race and civilization, focusing primarily on the dangers posed by colored peoples to white civilization. So you can already imagine where Darrow may have come out in dealing with Stoddard. The debate topic resolved that the immigration law discriminating in favor of the races of Northern Europe as opposed to those of Southern Europe is an advantage to the United States. The 1924 Immigration Act being debated came about following the end of World War I and the post-war recession. Many Americans believed that bringing in more immigrants from other countries would only make the unemployment rate higher. The law established preferences under the quota system for certain groups. Darrow opposed the law, was troubled by the intent behind it, and in true Darrow style, was passionate, forthright, and challenging in his response to Dr. Stoddard. So a little flavor of his arguments, and it's all relevant today. His opponents spoke of people already in the United States as if they owned the country, and Darrow, providing a reality check and defending the underdog, responded, they came over here to get a chance. The real American was the Indian, and they solved that problem by killing him. My ancestors came here to get a better chance, and I don't believe in closing the doors on the people who would like to come for the same reason now. And then Dr. Stoddard argued that the laboring man is against immigration. And Darrow countered with his focus on justice. I have always been for the poor man or the laborer, but I am not for injustice as I see it either for the rich man or the poor man. And then Stoddard argued that countries have a right to set rules and to set limits on who enters their borders. And Darrow responded as a dreamer and with empathy, I don't agree with him because I have an imagination, and that is all. I can imagine myself being an Italian and wanting a better chance, or being a Russian Jew and wanting a better chance, or being an Austrian and wanting a better chance. It is hard for me to forget there are other people on earth besides the stock I came from. And then Darrow, as the antagonist, truly his passion and way he approached a lot of issues, he said, to me, this whole idea is narrow, selfish, unimaginative, and cruel. The whole movement is narrow, stupid, mean, contemptible. Somehow, I can't believe it is a good thing. I think it would be a good thing for the United States to get a little idealism into herself.
What did he really think?
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Bain to introduce our keynote speaker.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Our four committee members are Nina Helstein, Nina Barrett, Anita Weinberg, and myself. I do this in honor of my mother, Joy Darrow, who participated in probably about 4.5 decades of these events while she was alive. So I'm proud to be here in her name. She really cared about all these issues as well. I'm also really proud to introduce Tania. I've known Tania for many, many years as an organizer and sometime writer for Windy City Times. She's an immigrant queer community organizer, a nationally recognized leader in the undocumented and immigrant rights movement, and she was one of the first undocumented youth to step into the public light to challenge immigration laws. Most recently, she has been a key organizer for the Not One More Deportation campaign, and also she works for the Chuy Garcia for Mayor campaign. And let me just say, when we planned this before the election, we both said, well, he might do a runoff, and that'll be okay too. So, welcome, Tania.
Thank you.
So thank you, Tracy, for the invitation, and thank you for to the commemorative committee for not letting us forget Clarence Darrow's legacy, as well as sharing some of that legacy with some of us who weren't as familiar with it. So yeah, thank you. I was reading that argument that we talked about, the 1929 immigrant defense argument, and one of the lines that struck me was, he said, if Jesus were to land in, I forget the exact place, but if Jesus were to land here, he'd be deported today. Wilmingham, I believe, is what he mentioned. And I can't tell you if that's true right now. I would have to look into Jesus's immigrant history, criminal history, where exactly he came from, how many times he's traveled or been deported to the United States. And to me, like, it's part of what I want to talk about today is precisely how immigrants are kind of divided into this good immigrant and bad immigrant categories. And I think part of what the argument that Darrow was making is that it's not just about looking at people's individual criminal history, immigration history, where they come from, but that when we talk about who's good and who's bad, who should be accepted and not accepted, who's in and who's out, it has to do with a bigger context than the individual. It has to do with the political context, with the racial context, with where people come from, poverty, how the historical context of the country. And I think that that's very much still true today. So I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit of my own history of how I came to work on immigrant rights, how I came to think of one of the campaigns that we're participating in as the Not One More campaign, as one of the goals that we should be trying to achieve. So I'll start with a little bit of my history, and then I do want to talk about where we are at today, precisely in terms of this judging who's a good immigrant, who's a bad immigrant, who gets to stay and who gets to go. I came to the U.S. when I was 10 years old with my parents. I was one of the, I think 60% of the 11 million immigrants who came here with a visa and overstayed and became undocumented since I was 10 years old. And growing up undocumented in the United States is, to say the least, slightly traumatic. It's not really knowing where you stand in the country. It's growing up learning about fighting for civil rights, about freedom, about what this country is supposed to represent, and at the same time feeling like you can't really access all those things and that those things don't really apply to you. It was trying to figure out who I could tell the truth to and who I had to lie to, and really understanding what that meant for my family and for my own stance in the United States. And so when I was in high school, I was trying really hard to be one of the good students. And every time, when teachers approached me about what scholarships I would be able to apply to, I would have to figure out whether I was going to say, no, I don't qualify because I'm not a U.S. citizen, or just kind of try to dismiss them. When I graduated from high school, I remember sitting down with my college counselor and him asking me, do you have a green card? And I said no. Him asking me, do your parents have thousands of dollars saved up for you to go to college? And I said no. And so he told me that the only way that I was going to be able to go to college was if I applied for an international student visa and applied as an international student. And what that meant was that I would have to leave the country, apply for an international student visa in Mexico, try to get the visa, and then be able to come back. And so I did. I was really angry actually at the time, and I remember thinking, I'm not gonna let whatever this is stop my education path. And I remember thinking, if I have to go to Mexico and that means I can't come back, that's fine, I'll figure it out. And so I left at 17 years old. I went to Mexico, I went to the US Embassy. I stood in these huge lines. They just have people kind of line up in this curved path And you can see just like people are going there with all this hope and not knowing where they're going to. I went to the window and I gave them my application for an international student visa. I gave them my acceptance letter to the colleges that I had been accepted to. And they sent me into a little room where I talked to a woman who said to me, this is worth nothing. And she grabbed my acceptance letter and put 2 lines across it. She took my Mexican passport and put it in a drawer. And then she turned around to the guard and said, "Can you believe this girl? She's trying to go into the United States while she's been living undocumented." And I remember her telling me, because you've been going to public school, your parents owe thousands of dollars to the US government because undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. And she told me, you're not gonna get your documents back until your parents pay that money and until you figure out like where you need to be. The thing is, like, I knew that my parents had been paying taxes. I had helped them figure out how we were gonna pay taxes, and you can actually, there's a number that you can use to pay taxes, whether you have a social security number or not. And I knew that, at the store, no one asks you, are you undocumented? Oh yeah, I won't charge you that 8%. And so to me, that was, I knew that was wrong. And being in Mexico, so what my parents started doing is they started organizing in the United States to try to see how they could get me back. And they went to community organizations, they went to congressmen, they went to senators. And it's one of those historical coincidences, I think, that they ended up talking to Senator Durbin, who that same summer had just discovered that there were these undocumented students who had been living in the United States for all of their lives that couldn't apply to be citizens, that couldn't go to high school. This was around 2001 summer. I graduated high school summer 2001. And Senator Durbin was able to actually bring me back into the United States through what was called a humanitarian visa, a humanitarian parole. But right before that happened, precisely because there were so many people like me, people started becoming interested both in my story and in the story of other undocumented students. And I remember reading an article in the Chicago Tribune by Teresa Puente, where she told my story and where she said, there's 60,000 to 80,000 undocumented students who graduate from high school every year, just like Tania. And that was the first time in my life that I connected what was happening to me in my life to something bigger than myself, to a bigger historical, legal context that was happening to other people in the United States. And that was really the first time that I understood that it wasn't that my mom was being overprotective when she told me I couldn't go to the school trip to France. Right, that it wasn't that the school was somehow discriminating against me when I couldn't get a job, as a lifeguard in high school. I was in the swim team. There was something bigger than all of us happening in the country if you had 60,000 to 80,000 undocumented students who were graduating every year and were facing the same problem. And so when I came back to the United States, I started talking about the issue publicly. And I wasn't saying I was undocumented yet, but it was kind of like, I just came back from Mexico and this is my story. And I did press conferences with Senator Durbin, and I still remember, the line that I would say at every press conference, and it was, there has to be something wrong in this country if 60 to 80,000 undocumented students who are dedicated, who are hardworking, can't go to school, can't go to college, can't work because they're lacking a social security number. And I was on my way to, this was again fall of 2001. And I was scheduled to go to testify in Congress in Washington, D.C. about the DREAM Act and about the need for the law to change. And my plane ticket was for September 11th, 2001. I remember that morning I woke up with a call from Clarisol Duque, who still works at Senator Durbin's office, her saying, this isn't gonna happen. Like, turn on your television, there's something bigger happening, like, you're not gonna testify today. And of course, saw the planes crashing into the towers in New York, and literally everything around immigration stopped on that day. I never got to testify. that congressional hearing never happened. And in the history of what was happening in immigration, everything just stopped. Right? All conversations around immigration became about national security, about how we needed to protect the country from immigrants, and and there was no conversation about undocumented youth, people who were living in the United States, the need for workers to have rights regardless of whether they're undocumented or not. And I myself went back, we joke slightly about it, but I went back into the shadows, sometimes we say. I went to college, I was at UIC, I decided to just, I was like, I'm back, I'm gonna go to school the way I wanted to go, and we'll figure out this immigration thing along the way. And what ended up happening to me is that I kept running into immigration over and over again. I remember being in my sociology class, sociology of immigration, of course, and people, raising their hands and discussing whether undocumented immigrants had rights, whether the country had a right to limit who comes in and out of their borders. And I remember just like hearing people talking around me and thinking, you're talking about me, and you're talking about my parents, and you're talking about it as if we're not in the room. And so that was the first time actually in one of my sociology classes that I raised my hand and I said, you're talking about me, right? Like, I'm undocumented. Whenever you say undocumented immigrants are stealing your jobs, you're talking about me. And I remember my teacher at the time kind of came back and said, you gotta watch out where you say those kinds of things, because you never know who's in the room. And I feel like I stopped talking about it too much, but there was something that really connected with me at that moment, not only in terms of this experience that I was having, but I was also starting to learn about the history of the gay and lesbian movement. I was starting to come out as a queer woman myself, and I was learning about the power of coming out and of sharing your story publicly as part of a political fight. And it just made sense to me that if people know that they're talking about you and your family, and they're standing next to you, or they're in the same class, that their perspective of what undocumented immigration is has to change. And so along the way, I met a couple of other young people. I was teaching this radio class at a community radio station, and most of my students were actually undocumented. And one of them, I remember, came to me and said, I have my own story, and raised up his jeans, and he showed me that he was wearing an ankle bracelet. And he told me the story, and the story was that he had been driving, he rolled through a stop sign, he had a beer and was a minor, and he was undocumented. And while he was in jail, waiting, not even declared guilty or anything, while he was in jail, he was visited by an immigration agent who asked him where he was from, whether he had papers or not, and basically had him sign his own deportation right on the spot. So this was someone who had been living in the United States since he was 6 years old. He was an honor student at Harold Washington, transferring over to UIC, and basically in that process was the president of a couple of university clubs, and who had obviously made a mistake that had landed him basically in deportation proceedings. And that was, to me, kind of the moment where I got called back into the immigrant rights fight. Again, like I said, I had been kind of going to school and raising my hand here and there, but I hadn't had something like this where it was, I felt like I needed to come back and talk more about my story. And, because he had this beer, right, because there was this connection to potentially a driving under the influence charge, no one wanted to defend him. Everyone would say to us that he was a bad example of an immigrant, and that, if anything, he deserved to get deported. And to me, this is where, again, like the writing of Clarence Darrow and the idea that like everything has a political context, that it's not as simple as guilty or not guilty, just and unjust, comes back. And so what we ended up doing was putting ourselves at the forefront to say, I'm undocumented. This could have happened to me. I could have been at the wrong place at the wrong time. I could have made a mistake. So when you say like this person deserves to be deported, you're also saying that to me. And so we ended up doing this entire movement almost exactly 5 years ago, where we were talking to each other and saying, you know what, like it actually does change things when you say to someone, I'm undocumented. And not only does it change the perspective of people who are on the outside, it actually made an impact on us. Because we had been hiding this whole time, because we didn't know when it was okay to say it and when we would have to lie, basically, as undocumented people. And so we decided to, I remember we were in this room and someone said, isn't there like a national coming out day for the LGBT community? Wouldn't it be great if we had some sort of national coming out of like somewhere around undocumented issues? And one of my friends says, where do undocumented people come out of? It's not the closet. Where do we come out of? And this is where, the shadows. Okay, so let's call it National Coming Out of the Shadows Day. And the first National Coming Out of the Shadows Day was on March 10th, 2010, almost 5 years ago. And actually there will be another one tomorrow at Federal Plaza at 12:30, where people will be speaking publicly about their stories. And so that was the first time that I stood up in front of a crowd of people and I said, my name is Tania and I'm undocumented. And there were like 10 other people lined up behind me who were saying the same thing. And at that moment, we actually had no idea what that would mean. There had been stories in the past. There was a young woman, Tam Tran, that in 2003 ended up testifying in front of Congress about her undocumented status, and immigration came to her parents' house the next day and detained them. And so there were histories and precedents of people being pursued for coming out and talking about their undocumented status. I was at risk of losing my job because, not supposed to be working. And again, we didn't know whether we were putting our parents at risk, so it wasn't just about us. And so we were trying to be very careful, but also knowing that we needed to take risks, and that that the change that happens only comes when people take these risks. And so we talked about it a lot, and we ended up saying like, yes, we're gonna do this. So on March 10th, we had our first national coming out of the shadows. And I won't go into this many details in terms of the rest of the stuff, but one of the things that's been really important is that along the way, we realized that, so a lot of things have changed since then, right? We have the Deferred Action Program from the President that actually has given people like me a chance to have a work permit and have a driver's license, and this is how I'm able to work for the Chuy Garcia campaign today with a work permit. And it's given people an incredible different sense of like being able to belong in the United States. But it's still this very clear line between who is considered a good immigrant and who's considered a bad immigrant. And what we didn't know at the time as undocumented students was that we were actually feeding very much into that rhetoric and into that dichotomy. That by saying, I'm undocumented and I have great grades and I've never been arrested and I speak English, and for some people they started saying, and it's not my fault because my parents brought me here. That was not our line. We were very much about standing with our parents and with their decision, but that was being said especially by politicians. And the reality is that through the years, as people have been able to gain some sort of foothold and some sort of status, we have left people out. And so we're at a place now where there's about half of the undocumented population has some sort of status, deferred action, and which is not citizenship, which is not stable, which you have to apply for every 2 to 3 years now, and then the other half doesn't. And so, for example, my parents don't qualify for any of the deferred action stuff because I'm not a citizen, and only people who are parents of citizens have been able to qualify. I think in Illinois, it's something like 52% of the not in Illinois, in Cook County, 52% of the undocumented population doesn't qualify for anything. And so that means you leave people in limbo, you leave people at risk. And the danger of being targeted and of being deported increases when you've been deported in the past, when you have some sort of criminal history, and when you have very little time in the United States. And so in the last week, immigration announced that they had done this operation cross-check, they call it, where they detained and deported 2,000 people who they're calling criminal aliens. And some people have some pretty bad criminal history, and of course that's the history that they highlight. But you also have people who have felonies because they came back into the United States after being deported. You have many, many people who are being deported because they have DUIs. And not that a DUI is a simple thing, but to me it shouldn't be a reason why someone gets deported. And so what we're working on now is not just talking about why the good immigrants deserve to stay, but really thinking through how the country uses deportation as a punishment and as a way to define who's good and who's bad. And so I'm working on this campaign. I'm working on this campaign at a national level. Right after the mayoral race, what I'm going back to is the Not One More campaign, which is a national campaign of people from all over the country that are trying to really break down the ways in which we separate immigrants into good immigrants and bad immigrants, and say that we need not one more deportation. And so I hope that you get more involved. I hope that you, I think as much as we've been able to advance, there's a lot of work still to do. And I hope that one day we are able to say that if Jesus comes to this country, whether he's undocumented or not, he won't be at risk for deportation.